Welcome to this explainer brought to you by the English Lit channel on YouTube. If you're studying literary theory, you are in exactly the right place. Today, we're diving deep into formalism to create the absolute ultimate study guide for English literature students. We're going to take some pretty complex critical history and break it down right here so you can master these concepts with total clarity. So forget about memorizing author biographies. Today, it is all about the text.
Here's our syllabus for today. We'll be covering the rejection of subjectivity, the new criticism playbook, aesthetic unity, Russian formalism, literariness, and we'll wrap it up with a side-by-side comparison of the two major schools. Let's jump right in.
All right, Section 1, Rejecting the Subjective View. Let's see exactly what formalism was reacting against in the early 20th century.
Okay, so to really understand formalism, you have to understand what came before it. Early 20th century criticism was, well, incredibly subjective. It was dominated by a mode called critical impressionism, and this was basically all about the reader's feelings. You'd read a poem and write an essay about how it made your soul feel or what you imagined the poor author was going through at the time. The formalists looked at this and completely rejected it. They saw this vibe-based approach as solipsistic and relativistic, meaning it was way too focused on the self and lacked any objective ground. So they went the other way entirely. They opted for a completely objective approach focused purely on artistic form and structure, completely ignoring any outside representations of reality.
And that brings us to the crucial point right here. Formalism simply does not care about the poet's emotions. It doesn't care about your emotional response as a reader, and it doesn't even care about how accurately a poem reflects the real outside universe. It privileges the literary work, and literally nothing else. The text has to stand entirely on its own as an object to be studied.
Which leads us to Section 2, the New Criticism Playbook and Anglo-American Autonomous Art.
So, a huge key concept for the new critics is the persona. Because they demanded we only look at the text, they had to solve a rather obvious problem. Well, who is talking in a poem if we're not allowed to say it's the author? To fix this, they strictly depersonalized poetry. They argued that the voice we hear is an internal, abstract, dramatic character, the persona, and definitely not the biographical author. So, when you read a devastating breakup poem, you aren't actually reading about the poet's real-life divorce, you're analyzing the dramatic speech of a totally constructed persona.
To pull off this kind of analysis without leaning on the author's life or the reader's feelings, new critics developed a technique I guarantee you've used in class: close reading, otherwise known as explication. It's a step-by-step intrinsic analysis. Step 1, you strip away absolutely all extrinsic matters, so no biography, no politics, no social history, none of it. Step 2, you refuse to simply summarize or paraphrase. A poem can never just be reduced to a simple thematic statement. In Step 3, you actively dissect its complex stylistic orchestrations. You're zooming in on the images, symbols, and tropes. For example, instead of claiming a poet wrote about a stormy sea because they were, clinically depressed, a close reader says, actually scratch that. Let's just look at how the harsh consonant sounds and aggressive metaphors physically mimic the crashing waves on the page.
Moving right along to Section 3, Aesthetic Unity and Persona. Let's see how these dissected pieces actually come back together.
This brilliantly illustrates their ultimate goal, finding what they called aesthetic unity. I want you to think of a poem as a tightly wound mechanical watch, or maybe a perfectly balanced symphony. Every single gear, every note, every image, and every trope relies entirely on the others to function. What the new critics were hunting for was an organic relationship between all these elements. And fascinatingly, they believe this overall unity almost always depends on artful ambiguity, paradox, or irony to hold it all together in perfect tension.
New critics saw this unity as a really special state of aesthetic suspension. This actually echoes Immanuel Kant's famous concept of purposiveness without purpose, as well as Samuel Taylor Coleridge's idea of a balance or reconciliation of opposite or discordant qualities. This highly crafted aesthetic form completely separates poetry from everyday communication like journalism or science writing. A newspaper article just gives you straight facts, right? But a poem suspends those facts in a beautiful, unified, and often ironic tension.
Let's cross the globe for Section 4 and take a look at the second major branch, Russian formalism.
So championed by brilliant critics like Roman Jakobson and Boris Eichenbaum, the Russian formalist actually shared a lot of DNA with the Anglo-American new critics. Much like their peers, they totally divorced literary criticism from psychology, sociology, and intellectual history. In fact, they were so allergic to psychology that they viewed literature strictly as a verbal art. It was more like a science of words to them than some outpouring of the human soul.
They flat out rejected the whole idea that literature was merely a reflection of reality or just a vehicle for expressing personal emotions.
But as we hit Section 5, Literariness and Creative Deviation, we're going to find out what made the Russian approach so unique.
And that unique thing is their intense focus on a concept called literariness. This is absolutely massive for your studies. Literariness is the distinguishing feature that separates literature from all other types of writing. How does it do that? By deliberately drawing attention to its own medium. Think of it like a painting where the artist uses these incredibly thick, textured, almost 3D brushstrokes. They don't just want you to look at a bowl of fruit, they want you to notice the actual paint itself. In literature, this paint is the complex texture of formal devices, the versification, the unique style, the narrative structure. It is literally language making itself noticeable.
And this brings us to a fundamental distinction between the two camps. While our new critics were always looking for how elements artfully converge to create aesthetic unity, the Russian formalists were all about creative deviation. The Russians wanted to see how a text intentionally broke the established literary conventions of its specific historical background. They wanted to see how a poem made language strange or unfamiliar, basically to wake the reader up and make them notice the medium itself.
All right, let's move to our final section, comparing the two schools, the ultimate formalist showdown. If you are taking notes for an exam, this is the essential study guide matrix you need to lock in right now. Notice the side-by-side differences here. Anglo-American New Criticism views the text as an autonomous entity, focusing heavily on convergence. Their key concepts are the persona, explication, and aesthetic unity, and their main analytical goal is to find that organic unity, usually held together by irony or paradox. Now look at the bottom row. Russian formalism views literature as a verbal art focused on deviation. Their key concepts are literariness and formal devices, and their analytical goal is to examine exactly how the text creatively deviates from standard literary conventions.
Now you might be wondering, why does all this matter to us today? Well, because formalism's impact on the Anglophone sphere literally cannot be underestimated. It became the absolute dominant mode of modern literary criticism. It was so influential and so foundational to how literature was taught in universities that a huge chunk of later postmodern theory essentially had to define itself by reacting against this very framework. To understand postmodernism, you first have to understand the formalism it was rebelling against.
Which leaves us with one final provocative question to ponder as we wrap up this explainer. If formalism strictly demands we completely ignore the author's life, their politics, and the surrounding social history to treat the text purely as an autonomous object, what vital parts of the human experience does this purely objective lens leave entirely in the dark? It is an incredibly powerful tool for close reading, no doubt about it, but it absolutely comes with distinct blind spots. Take some time to think about what a purely formal analysis might miss. Thank you so much for joining me on the English Lit channel for this deep dive into formalism. Keep studying, keep questioning, and I will see you in the next explainer.